Today we're going to be talking about test optional college admissions, some myths and facts about what it is, and then just generally about navigating the college applications and admissions process and the landscape as it's changed over the past few years with the pandemic, et cetera. My name is Tal Kitron with Appleruth Tutoring Services. I've been with the company for about 10 years now in various capacities. I work full-time these days as an online tutor. So I tutor PSAT, SAT, ACT, and that's one of the cornerstones of Appleruth. We also do academic prep, executive function coaching, and some writing work as well. I'm here today just to talk a little bit about the testing aspect, but then we're going to kind of transition that into college admissions and how it impacts you. We will make sure to leave time for questions and answers at the end. So as they occur to you, feel free to shoot them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we get to those. So starting off today, let's just talk about some things that have changed a little bit. I think that at the height of the pandemic, so kind of 2019, 2020, things shifted a lot. Admissions offices had to make big adjustments. A lot of those changes have endured and will likely continue to endure. Some of the things that we've been seeing is there's a lot more virtual stuff. I mean, of course, in-person was impossible or difficult at a lot of times. So they've supplemented in-person activities with virtual. There are still on-campus events, and there's still the roadshow, which is colleges going around to high schools and visiting different states, but there's a lot more that you can do virtually. Some colleges have done more alumni outreach, and then we'll talk about how application volume has increased. So a lot of colleges have hired more readers and just people to read applications and evaluate. Some of the challenges, I mean, one of the biggest ones is that colleges always are uncertain of, depending on how many people they accept each year, how many will then matriculate and attend. So since COVID, it's been incredibly difficult for them to predict yield, as in we're going to accept this many, but how many will come? It's not the typical percentage. So that's kind of thrown a wrench into things. And we're going to get into kind of the test optional idea, which is that you can submit an application to a college or university without an ACT or SAT score. Those who do that, those who choose not to send test scores, will see that in-person interest is going to be more important. And what we've seen is just the data are a little bit skewed. It's a little bit dated at this point. And so the main takeaway is that because of the uncertainty, more people have applied, more people are accepted, more people are being waitlisted, and then more people are coming off those waitlists. So it's really kind of done a number on an applications landscape in general. What we've seen, again, in the past two and a half years is a lot more waitlists. So those people who apply to college, and instead of getting acceptance or rejection, they get put on a waitlist, which is, we're not rejecting you. We would like to accept you, but right now we have too many people. We're going to see how many people come, and then maybe you can get off the waitlist. I have seen more people get off waitlists in the past couple of years than I had before that. And there are several reasons we talked about for why those waitlists have been longer. Because of some of these changes, early action and early admissions have played a big role. So if you're a 12th grader or a parent or guardian of a 12th grader, you may already know this. Like some of the early action and early decision deadlines, they've all pretty much passed. And actually students have already, for the most part, started hearing back from early action schools. So if you apply early decision, that's you saying, I am committing to go to this college if I get in. You raise your odds of getting in by going early action. There's just a bigger pool of students accepted, and it demonstrates commitment on your end. Beyond that, there are the regular deadlines that are coming up in the next couple months, but then there's also what are called early decision 2 deadlines. So let's say you applied to your dream school early action and you were deferred, meaning we're not going to accept you, but we'd like you to apply again in the regular round. If that happens, the things that we're going to talk about are like other ways to show your interest. So writing what's called an LOC, letter of commitment, just saying, hey, I know that I'm not in yet. I just want to assure the admissions office, this is my school of choice. I want to come here. I'm still committed. Those are the kind of things that can really help put a student over the top, right? If they're choosing between two students to admit with similar profiles, they'll pick the one who's made it clear they want to come to our school and be on this campus. And then we've got these early decision 2 deadlines. I think it's like January 1st or 2nd, and then 5th and 15th. Those are just another round of early potential applications. And we'll look at some stats about that later. We mentioned that admissions offices have had to change their methods and what they're doing. In general, they're just working harder. So what we're seeing is if a college that used to require SAT or ACT to submit an application no longer does, let's use an example, University of Michigan, right? So the Harvard of the Midwest, as they call it. And for a long time, you had to submit an SAT or ACT score. And then during COVID, they went, like many other colleges, test optional. So if you have a score you want to submit with your application, you can, or you can decide, no, I'm going to go test optional. When this change happened, many more students started applying, because in the past, maybe it's like, well, I don't have the test score I need for Michigan, I shouldn't even apply. Now, instead, people are saying, well, I've got the grades, right? I should be able to get in. The only thing I don't have is test scores, but I can go test optional and submit with that. So application numbers have gone up a lot. That didn't come with an increase in like admissions offices budget or more employees. And then when you are evaluating, we'll talk about this more too, but when you're evaluating an application without SAT, ACT, it almost by definition makes you look harder at the other stuff. So information gaps, just lots of challenges for admissions offices, and some things that they're kind of doing a bit differently that we can consider as we're doing those college apps. So we're going to move to academics and then to the testing part, and then just really into like the test optional world and what that is. So one sad reality is that A's in school aren't as special as they once were. You know, for one thing, GPA is hard to standardize. Meaning 4.0 at one school is not the same as a 4.0 at a school, 2 miles down the road. It depends on a lot of things, including academic rigor, AP classes, right? Just a whole bunch of stuff. So these days, GPA is not a great predictor of college success. It's still one of the 3 most important things for applying to college, but A's aren't as important as they once were, or not as impressive. So it's kind of rough because you still need them, and then yet they're still not as impressive now as they once were. So kind of a catch-22 there. Things we can control, so activities and how they factor in. What we are looking for is continuity. So you want to make sure you've demonstrated that you've done something consistently. That may have not been the case during COVID. Maybe there was a year where you were all online, right? So making sure that you are doing something consistently and showing that depth and persistence, even in years that were a little bit different. So maybe not varsity tennis, right? But played with friends, right? Or played with a relative to keep fresh. I'm a big sports person, but it's definitely important to have involvement beyond sports. So like, why is this person unique? And you want to always be thinking about, what do I offer to this school while I bring to campus, right? You're really trying to sell yourself to the school as a good candidate and someone who will boost that school's profile, right? And really make them more attractive to other students. And so here's what I mentioned about, like, if you can't play in 10th grade because we were out of school or what have you, you can demonstrate, well, I was on varsity 9th, 11th, and 12th, and then that year I was out of school, this is what I did to maintain, right? So it doesn't have to be the exact same activity, but you can still demonstrate continuity. And I think colleges know that some things might be a little bit funky, right? A couple of years ago, especially. So demonstrated interest is a phrase that we talk about a lot. It is exactly what it sounds like. So, the question, why should I go on college visits? It's so that you can demonstrate interest and that the college admissions offices can log that interest for their records. And you can bet that if you sign up for a virtual event, they know if you logged in, they know if you asked questions, you're being evaluated digitally, instantly. So those are things that people don't really consider, but like that's the type of engagement you want. It's super easy, right? Just register for an event. And then just by showing up, asking a question or two, it shows your interest. And that's a note on your application. Do make sure that you know what you're signing up for. So it's good to have a question or two prepared. You don't talk about interviews later. That's also smart. So just make sure that you know what's coming and use it as experience and information. And again, even if we can't do a tour because it's far away or because various reasons, these virtual events are now offered, really most schools, if not all, do some sort of virtual events. And so you want to take advantage of those. The interview has become a bit more salient, a bit more important because the playing field is leveled based on, like we said, the grades and how things are just harder to standardize. So if you do an interview, and if you're doing these interviews for colleges, don't start with your first choice. Practice first. Come prepared with questions, right? So you're going to look at the school website. You're just going to think about some thoughtful questions that you think you want to know, or just will show also your interest. And like I said, just more schools have been putting a bit more weight on this. It's not only for super rich folks, because these are just often done via Zoom. And most folks either at home or at school have some sort of device they can connect with. So don't just jump into that interview with your first choice school. Practice for a few rounds, and that will make perfect. And then the other piece of this is letters of rec. So when I taught in a high school, I always really appreciated when a student asked me, well, first off, when they asked me, like with time to spare, politely, early, and it's important to connect with a teacher or a counselor and make sure that you know that whoever you're asking is going to give you a good recommendation, someone you've built rapport with. Like for example, when that move happened online, so maybe some of us were in 9th or 10th or 11th grade, probably 9th or 10th, you may have, a lot of people struggled a lot. But I think teachers who maintained relationships with students and the students who really showed effort online, that's almost more impressive in a lot of ways. Might be a good time now to say, hey, do you remember how involved I was this semester despite challenges? Do you think you'd be willing to write me a letter of recommendation? Make it easy for them too, right? So tell them exactly what it is you need. If it's envelopes that are stamped that they need to send it off in, give them that. Right? If it's an email address they're supposed to send to, make sure that you kind of wrap it up in a bow for the teacher, and make sure that you ask them with time to spare, right? That's more guarantee that you get a good letter. And I wrote the best letters for the students who demonstrated that they cared about my time. And those were often the students who were the most diligent generally, right? But yeah, just be really thoughtful about who you ask, when you ask, how you ask. So now we're just going to talk a bit about the testing world, which will then launch us into test optional admissions for the rest of our presentation. So we've touched on some of these, but take a look at what are the factors that influence admissions decisions for colleges and universities these days. I'm looking at those top 6 or 7. Grades are still super important, especially in core classes. Academic rigor, more important than ever. So like you see people my students are taking like 5 AP classes a year, which seems crazy, but that's what's happening. Then test scores, so still a huge factor. Even in the test optional landscape, test scores still a huge factor. We'll talk about the nuances there. Essay, meaning personal statements. And then you can see like a little bit below that, we got recommendations, demonstrated interest, which is registering and attending events, et cetera. And then below that, class rank, extracurriculars, APs, et cetera. All this goes to show that testing is still a big piece of it. It is not the be all end all, far from it, but it's still one of the top 5 things that a lot of colleges are looking at for an applicant. These are the 2 major college entrance exams. And these are the 2, broad brush major differences. Both are accepted universally in that There's no college that prefers the SAT over the ACT or vice versa. The short and skinny is that the SAT is a more rigorous, more analytical test, a lot more reading, just tougher. The ACT is simpler generally, but has a bit tougher math, has a science section, which is about data interpretation, and is a time crunch. That's one of the biggest things, is the ACT is super fast paced. But you can see there's a ton of overlap. So about 80% overlaps. Like, let's say, I'm speaking to a 10th grader or a parent of a 10th grader, or even, a junior, where you probably want to be thinking about starting this process of test prep pretty soon here. The ideal is you want to pick a test and stick with it. So you take a practice test for both. You choose the test you're stronger with. If it's a tie, you go with the one you like better. And then you register for a few tests. We'll show you when the dates are for that in a moment. And ideally, whichever test you choose, that's the one you stick with. Once in a blue moon, I do have a student who we work on SAT and something's not clicking, or the first official test didn't go great, and we decide to switch to ACT. And in that case, a lot overlaps, but it's not ideal. You want to just kind of take one test and go with it. You can see the overlap has to do with the same type of math generally. Both will involve data analysis, reading and English skills. Then the ACT's got that math and science. SAT is going to be more wordy. But to me, this is the big difference. Well, not, I guess, next page. But here, the timing is about the same. What you'll see is 4 sections for each. The SAT no longer has an essay. The ACT, nobody really requires it anymore, so it's effectively gone. You can see that the SAT has 2 math sections, whereas ACT finishes with math and science. But check out the time per question. And as I said, if you've got questions that come up, please put them in there. I got one about test optional, which we're going to answer momentarily. I think we're about probably 12 slides away from that. What you can see here is that the ACT is just a time crunch. You get 60 math questions in 60 minutes, 40 reading questions in 35 minutes. So the ACT is just really a test of speed. Some people like that and do fine with it. Others, that's prohibitive, and they just say, well, I'm going SAT. And then just last bit on the test differences. Math is the area of the greatest divergence, meaning SAT is going to be more Common Core. So a lot of algebra, a lot of just factoring, foiling, and basic algebra steps. The ACT is going to get more into trig, geometry, stats, pre-calc, and then even back like towards arithmetic. So ACT, you kind of never know what to expect. SAT really is all in that Common Core realm. Here you can see just a breakdown of some of the things on each test. My general rule would be if you're super strong in math and not that strong on the verbal, ACT is often a better test. And then if the opposite is true, right, you like the verbal stuff, but the math is more of a struggle, you might want to focus SAT since it's more finite. There aren't that many math concepts. Trig, an afterthought on both. Algebra heavy on SAT. And then you can see ACT gives you a bunch more geometry. So that is another big difference. And this is more that I would get in depth in a ACT versus SAT presentation, but I think for today we can gloss over it a bit. If people have questions specifically about those tests, just ask them at the end. So now getting into the logistics, and as we think about applying to colleges, one thing that almost everyone will want to do, even if you're pretty sure that the tests aren't for you, is take a baseline mock test. There are free ACTs and SATs online, a bunch of SATs especially. Appleworth offers in person in Seattle and Chicago and Atlanta and everywhere we have an office, but also online tests, really easily done. Take a practice test for SAT and ACT, or just compare your practice ACT to your PSAT, which we've taken in school. If one test is much higher, obviously we're going to stick with that test. If they're even, go with what you like better. And then again, like I said, if we have to switch, it's okay. It's not the best, but it's not the end of the world either. And generally, you want to plan on 2 or 3 official tests. It takes most people 3 official tests to reach full potential. I've seen students who are like, man, I'm going to get this score one and done, but it puts undue pressure. It's pretty rare that you can just take one test and be through it. It's just a lot of pressure. And so then just talking timeline, there are some myths about, I used to hear in high school, well, if you pick an answer to guess, always pick C because it's more often correct than A, B, or D, which just isn't true. And the same here is like the March test isn't harder than the May test, isn't harder than the October test. It just varies from year to year. There's no consistent trend. They're not flying in like all the geniuses for one certain test or anything like that. It's graded on a curve. Yes, occasionally there's a tough test or an easy test, but there's not really a rhyme or reason to that. So do not take a test based on, oh, I've heard the March test is easier. It's all about just your own timeline. So again, like this is what I do, but elements to successful prep, mock tests are big. So I would say take one at the beginning to set a baseline. Every 3 or 4 sessions, so every 6 hours of tutoring, take another mock test. Make sure you take one 2 or 3 weeks before the official test. Don't cram. This is not a test that you can cram for. So start early and distribute your practice. Spend time on the task, both in session individually and on practice tests. Always work backwards from official tests. So when we schedule, we're always working backwards from a couple of official tests to lead up to them with momentum. And then early on, set a goal to work towards. And then finally, here are when the tests are. So like, for example, in the spring, I'd be targeting the March, May, and maybe June SATs, depending on my AP exam schedule. Or if I was going ACT, I'd probably be taking a first test in February, second one in April, and then planning on my last one in June or July if I need it. Notice those March, May, and October tests for SAT offer the QAS, which means you can get the full questions and answers back. That is one reason that March and May are my 2 favorite tests, I think, for people to take. So like if I was an 11th grader in the spring and I hadn't taken the test yet, I'd probably be targeting that March and May SAT, if not February and April ACT. You think about when you're really busy at school or with athletics or extracurriculars, and do plan around that because it's a big time commitment. It's like 3 hours on a Saturday morning. So if you're a football player and you know that you're going to have Friday night football, you don't want to run the risk of having a late night game, right? And then you got to wake up early for a test. We want to plan around that. So now what's happening? So like, as we consider, do we take these tests? Do we need to take these tests? Like just to show you what's happening over the next couple of years, or at least what we envision is happening. And the ACT has been talking up changes to digital for years. If you take the test internationally, for the past several years, it's all been on the computer. So there's already a computer-based ACT. Anyone internationally is taking it that way. And that haven't taken it on a paper in years. Domestically, though, it's still just how it's always been. Test booklet, Scantron, bubble in, send it out. They also, ACT mentioned that they were going to do section by section testing, which would be so awesome because you could just, oh man, I didn't do well on math, I'm just going to take the math section this Saturday. Or man, in February, I did great on everything but science. So then in April, I'm just going to take the science section only. I mean, that's huge. But it's all been kind of delayed. They haven't made an announcement in quite a while, so we don't have a timing update on that. Stay tuned. At some point, it will all switch up to digital, but I think there will probably be a paper option for a good long while, if not forever, for ACT. And one of the reasons to take the test more than once, again, this all applies to the application process, which is to say that most schools do what's called super scoring. So that means if you do submit multiple test scores, a college that super scores will only see the highest section scores across multiple sittings. As an example here, this student got a 1300 in March and a 1310 in June, and even lower in May, but the super score that colleges will see is 1330. All the student has to do is submit their March score and their June score, and then the college that super scores will make this their super composite. So those schools won't know how many times they took the test. They'll just see that 1330. Huge benefit to taking it multiple times. Most will super score the SAT, and about half-ish super score ACT, because that's such a big advantage with 4 separate sections. So always check if your school super scores or not. And the way ACT does it now is like if you take multiple tests, this is what you see on your website is the actual super score will just bounce up. So here you see scores from April, September, and December, which have combined to get this person's composite score. So if they were going to take it one more time, they'd probably be focusing on English and science to see if we can get those up into at least the 20s. Now the SAT also announced some changes. So one is that there's no such thing as SAT subject tests anymore. Those used to be things that you would take at the end of a year of classes, and it would be for college credit, but also just a nice thing for elite colleges. But those no longer exist. They've been replaced by AP exams. And then there's no more SAT essay. So after your 4th and final section on SAT, there's now what's called a section 5 experimental. It's not an essay, it doesn't count. So no more writing portion. As I said, the reason that those subject tests went away, which I think is a great thing, is just that AP exams were just getting so popular. So you could see the subject tests were going down, official SAT was going up, and so were APs, which are also administered by College Board. So they decided that the SAT subject tests were unnecessary and redundant, and I guess they weren't making enough money off of it to justify continuing. So good, we like that. What is coming is a more flexible, streamlined, and digital SAT, and it's actually going to come next year, we think. So what we've got is 4 free digital tests that are available already, so people can go and play with those and just see how it is. Appleruth is definitely going to have its finger on the pulse, and as it transitions, we'll do webinars, we'll send out info, we'll learn about it, and we will transmit that information to you guys. And so for me, it's going to be especially interesting because this is what I do all day is I tutor SAT and ACT. So one of the major tests is changing completely, just like it did 7 years ago. And I think we can talk a bit about how that impacts decision-making when it comes to testing, because I do think it factors in. What will be changing is the test will be shorter. So shortening by almost like 35%. It will not be as big of a time crunch. SAT never really was, but even less so now. Shorter reading passages. So instead of like many, many paragraphs, might just be like 1 paragraph, 1 question. There's no longer a no calculator section. So you can use the calculator the whole time. It's still scaled out of 1600. And because it's on the computer, there's just going to be different, you don't have to worry about the forms leaking or anything like that to the public. There should be more flexibility for school day SATs. So we'll see probably more of those along with the general 7 dates. And probably the craziest and coolest thing is that it's adaptive. So when the digital SAT changes, it will be section adaptive, meaning unlike the GRE, which if you get a hard question correct, your next question is going to get harder and so on. On the SAT, it's going to be a section adaptive. So like on your first reading section, if you do super well and you get all the hard questions right, your second reading section is going to be like this in the bracket of the tough stuff. You're going to be on the high end of the curve. Versus if you struggled on the first section, then your second one's going to be a little bit easier. It's going to adapt and you're going to be in this kind of lower bracket of curves. You can still be on the higher end of it depending on how you do. So that's going to be super interesting. Those practice tests and College Board are, one way to kind of look at that. But the deal here is there's not going to be one set test form, so it's better for test security. And of course, that means that earlier questions can really affect your scores because it's going to set you up for what's coming next. So this will all be just really groundbreaking, different, cool. Some things that are going to be great are the accommodations will be much better, I think. So like bigger fonts and different colors and just a lot easier to accommodate students who have LDs. But yeah, I just think it's a huge shift. And the timing is going to be like PSAT this coming year, so like October 2023. Internationally, the SAT also next year. And then 2024, we're going to switch domestically. That's the plan. These are the advantages. We can skip over this. I think we talked about it. Faster results, that's the other good thing. And so here's the timeline. And they've changed things in 2015 when they said they were changing, they delayed it by a year, but probably a bit more reliable than ACT's timeline, which is completely nebulous. So we can plan to see this stuff, the next year or so. So now, second half of the presentation is really about test optional and what it is. I do think probably some questions will come out of this, but I've done my best to try to address them in the presentation. The 4 types of admissions policies when it comes to SAT and ACT. So we talk about testing in the next 20 minutes or so. It's all about SAT, ACT. Those are the college entrance exams. And again, interchangeable. No college prefers one over the other. So what you've got is these colleges and universities that are test required. Used to be a huge amount of them, and now not so many. Test optional, which has been all the rage. Test flexible, which is pretty much non-existent. And then test blind, meaning you won't see you can't submit scores. What test optional means at its heart is even if a student has not submitted SAT or ACT scores, which you have an option to do with your application, if you did not, the college will still consider that application complete and review it. There's going to be a pool of applications with scores. So this is my SAT, ACT score pool. And there's going to be some people who apply without scores for various reasons. When an application does have a test score attached, of course, the college is going to look at it. If it's test optional, that means that if you submit a test score, the college will look at it. And if you don't, they won't. Your choice. So there's some strategy involved with that. Someone asked this question. So this is from the last admission cycle, but it hasn't changed much. 1,800 plus schools were test optional, which is more than 3/4 of all colleges and universities in the US. That means that test optional is the dominant position, huge shift. Only about 1,000 before, so fewer than half were test optional. And there are a ton of colleges and universities that I think a lot of us think about. So the ones that when I was in high school, I heard about, or when I was teaching, this is where my students wanted to go. Many, many, many of those have gone from test required now to test optional, at least for the time being. And so that's the landscape right now. Test optional is the dominant position of colleges and admissions offices. So we have to figure out, what does that mean for us? This is, again, a survey from a few years ago. Ernst & Young and Parthenon, they estimated that within 3 to 5 years, so that means around 2025-ish, 20 to 30% of colleges would require testing, to be test required. They estimated 60 to 70% would be test optional, and about 5 to 10% would be test blind. And they actually, even though this was a high estimate, they underestimated test optional. So it's more like 75, closer to 80% of schools are test optional. Significant number. As colleges have shifted to test optional, or just kind of made those changes, a lot of them don't want to announce what their permanent decision or stance will be, for a few reasons. But one is just we want to see more data, just kind of how this test optional world is working compared to other colleges and universities, and kind of see what people are doing after they graduate and how people are performing. And also, we mentioned just that yield rate of just being unsure of how many people you accept will come in. And so I think that's something they're always balancing with and seeing okay, well, as we have this many people submitting SAT, ACT, and this many who aren't, how does that impact how many people we should accept and how many people actually end up attending? So it's just kind of still a little bit in a state of flux, but some colleges have started making decisions. For example, the Georgia schools and the Florida schools have gone back to test required. They were test optional for a couple of years, and you didn't have to submit SAT or ACT for UGA or UF, but now you do again. right? So it's really in South Carolina too. It's like the South that has kind of changed back, and most of the other rest of the country hasn't and may not at all change from test optional. So into this myth or fact phase. So first, is this a myth or a fact? Test optional means you don't submit ACT or SAT score with your application. Well, the answer to that is it's a myth. Test blind is not the same as test optional. Now, I will say the majority of students who are admitted to test optional schools are still submitting test scores. And actually those scores have gotten stronger because there are more people applying and you have a choice. So only those students who are at the tip top with these great scores are submitting, but it seems like there are just higher numbers. And because, like I said, you can't standardize a GPA from one school to another, standardized tests are still a good way to predict success, and they're still a good way to set students apart. So what I expected as a tutor when this all shifted and COVID hit and tests were canceling and colleges decided we're not going to require them, I thought, well, work's going to be slow for a while and people aren't going to take these tests. And it just really hasn't, for whatever reason, hasn't been the case. It's gotten more competitive in a lot of ways. People are definitely still trying the tests, but then I think there are also a lot of families that are making kind of early, mature, strategic decisions to say, these tests, aren't for me. I'm going to focus on other stuff and go test optional. So those are the things we need to think about. And I think every person is going to be different, right? So it's not going to be an easy decision. And it's also probably going to differ from school to school. So we'll talk about strategic submission today. Here are some reasons why you would or would not submit a score. Hey, if you got the grades and the extracurriculars in your Harvard material, but then you take the SAT and you get a great score, but not like a Harvard score, like we get like a 1250. Submitting that SAT score of 1250 is not going to help you at Harvard. It's just not. But if Harvard is still test optional, then what you do is you just submit your application and you don't submit a test score there. But maybe you're also applying to, just a local school, or you're applying to, I don't know, Nebraska, because you're from Nebraska. And then maybe a 1250 is in the range for Nebraska, right? So maybe there, I am going to submit this because it will help. It might even get me scholarship money. And so in that case, that would communicate, oh man, I'm a good tester and we should include it for this school, but not for that school. If you find that you have holes, so like meaning for me, my academic rigor wasn't amazing because I chose my junior year instead of taking pre-calc and calc, I took statistics and I didn't take math senior year. Great decision in my opinion. But I do think some colleges looked at that and said, that's not the level of math we're looking for. So my high SAT math score made up for that, or at least I think would assure some of them, okay, well, he's not just a poor math student, he just didn't take that class. And then, as I mentioned, testing can affect merit-based scholarships and also placement. What I mean by that, like here's an example, Wabash College. These are some scholarships that if you have a certain GPA and you submit a test score over a certain threshold, and these are good scores, but like 20 on ACT or 1030 SAT is about 50th percentile nationally. So it's not like otherworldly. And you can get these, pretty impressive automatic scholarships just from meeting that level. So you apply with an ACT of 29 above and your GPA is a 4, you're going to get a $32,000 scholarship. And to keep it, you just need to maintain a GPA over a certain level at school. So that still is the case. There aren't a huge amount of colleges and universities that give automatic scholarship, but there's a decent amount. Here's another one. So Alabama, you got tuition for in-state being a fairly reasonable 11,000, but out of state 30,000. Yikes. And then you see some of these scholarship awards, which are given so that they can help increase their own profile, right? They want you to come there because your scores are high, your GPA is high. That will make Alabama look better. So if you've got a GPA over 3.5 and a fairly good SAT or ACT score, you're getting money to come to Alabama, right? You're not paying $30,000 a year. What we saw from the test optional switch, and we mentioned this, it meant application numbers go way up. So some of the things we're seeing, and I mentioned it, selective schools have become even more selective. So look at some of these numbers. You see 2019 on the right, 2021 on the left. This is what percent of applicants got in. So you can see like in UGA, in 2019, almost half of those who applied got in, and then that number dropped by about 7% in 2021. Duke's numbers basically got cut in half, right? So what that means is there's just many more people applying because they think, well, I don't have the test scores to get into Duke, but I got the grades, right? And so I think that's a good thing, evens the playing field quite a bit. Let's see, like at Emory, 19% 2019, 13% 2021. That's a really big difference. Myth or fact? If you apply to a test optional school and you decide either you haven't taken the tests or you've taken them and they're not in the range you want them to be for that college, if you choose not to submit test scores, is it a myth or fact that schools may look more closely at other aspects of your application? That is a fact. Cornell is an example. If you submit test optional, you are going to have increased scrutiny on the rest of your application, letters of rec, your schedule, what classes you took, activities and diversity and experiences, personal statements, right? So all that stuff will just be heightened because they don't have those test scores to fall back on, right? So that could be a really good thing though, if these are the highlights of your application, right? You're a good writer, that can really help you stand out. So we can kind of look at some of the recent shift. In the past, test optional wasn't a big thing. So this is like kind of a sample, I think from, I can't remember how many years ago, but 5-10 years ago. And what it found is that most students who were admitted to test optional schools still submitted tests. And again, this just to say that a different way. Even though colleges have gone test optional, most students are still submitting test scores, and a slightly higher percentage of admitted students are those who applied with test scores. In other words, I don't want to say there's an edge to submitting because it's not that clear, but historically, test optional wasn't a big thing, and it wasn't like a strategy decision. It was just, I'm applying to these schools, I'm going to submit my tests. Right? That's how it was when I was growing up. And then now, so you can look at like 3 years ago, 4% of students strategically submitted and thought about like, well, how do I, do I pick one method for one school and one for another? Now people are really doing that. So they're talking with their counselors and they're talking with friends and parents and teachers and tutors. And even 2 years ago, about a quarter of students were strategic submitters. So they applied to 7 or 8 colleges. They sent their ACT, SAT to some and not to others. Right? That's, again, a huge, huge shift. And I think now it's even higher than that. Most of my students are thinking about this in one way or another. Some more data. So this is again just what percent of applicants submitted test scores. And this is kind of a nice number where you see that it used to be that like 70, 80, 90% of people were submitting test scores. And then the following year, the COVID year, where a lot of people couldn't take tests and schools went test optional, then whether it was private, public, selective, or not, all those numbers went down. So like more like half of students who were applying submitted test scores and the other half did not. So that's what I mean by evening the playing field, is that we used to have, it's just you take the test, you submit the tests, and that helps you get in. And now it's a lot more nuanced. couple other things to consider. So one is that, as you strategically submit, if you're a STEM person, for example, it may be more important to do testing, and it may be a math score that's in the 700 or 800 for SAT could be really compelling, and you might want to send that. But you can see then, so this is a university where 59% of applicants submitted test scores, but only 35% of education majors, versus if you're applying for engineering, almost everyone did. So that's just a little bit of a difference between majors and how that might impact whether or not we submit tests. And this stuff's going to keep changing, right? It's mostly back to normal. Like I said, the southern states have been shifting back to test required a little bit. But as far as how many people are taking the test and applying, we're back to the numbers we were before 2019. So it's pretty much back to normal. About half of people are taking ACT, half SAT, and we'll see what this shift to digital does. Okay, another myth or fact. We're going to get to questions here in a moment. So the question here is it a myth or a fact that test score submitters have an edge over those who choose not to submit scores? So it's a test optional university. Does someone who submits a score have an advantage over someone who does not, all other things being equal? The answer is, I'm not sure. It's a mixed bag. If I had to answer it, I would say yes, testers had a slight advantage. But it varies. So at Tufts, over half of people didn't submit test scores in the early decision range, and then over half were admitted without scores. Williams was kind of the flip of that. Penn as well, 76% of early decision admits did have test scores. So that's interesting. For an elite school like Penn, most people are still submitting. And you may have an advantage for submitting a high score. You probably do. Same with Georgetown. But again, it's not black or white. You can't just say, yes, you should test. Very different based on person, school, and other factors. You can look at some of these numbers when they were comparing admissions rate for students who did submit ACT, SAT against those who didn't. And so at these schools, especially at Emory and at Tech, you can see it's double the amount. So the admissions rate was, you're twice as likely almost to get in if you submitted a score. And then at Vanderbilt, it was not that compelling. Right? So these are just kind of cool things to explore, and you see which school really puts heavy weight on it and which ones don't. So last myth or fact, I shouldn't even try the ACT or SAT. It's not worth it. Right? And I hear people saying that, right? They don't like the PSAT. They feel like, oh, I'm a bad test taker. I'm too busy. It's still a myth. It's still a myth. You should try the ACT and SAT before making any decisions. And I say that as a tutor. This is obviously what pays the bills, but I say that more as I try to treat any of my students as if they were, I don't have children, but my child or me. And you want to keep your options open and open up opportunities for yourself. So it's very wise to get a baseline SAT and ACT score in. And then if you look at some of the colleges you're thinking about, you look at your scores and you think, oh, it's not too far off. You should take the tests. Preparing, it might play to your advantage. There's little to no downside. Then again, if you take the test and you're like, man, here are the schools I want to go to. My scores are nowhere near it. It's going to be very hard for me to get there. Maybe you do test optional and you just don't think about it. That is an option these days, even though that's kind of a hard decision to make. But I would say try them, see how they go, and then go from there. And then should we send our test scores in? So I'm going to kind of blow through these last few slides so we have time for the questions that I see coming up here. But when you ask yourself, should I send in my test scores? Here are the questions to ask. And it's really a logical thing. One is, are the scores going to add value to my application? Will they make me look better or worse? Are they something you want the admissions office to see? Those are pretty simple questions. Some opinions. This is just, we talked about how in STEM, the test scores might matter more. All right, so it might be test optional is fine in liberal arts or, in reading and English majors, but then as soon as you are doing science or math or engineering, you probably want to submit a test score, at least for this particular college. And the way you should decide, you have to be a bit careful because data could be old or skewed, but you can Google any college. So say Emory University, SAT 25th to 75th percentile, or SAT quartiles. And they'll show you of the admitted students, here was the range from 25th to 75th percentile. If you are below 25th or even below 50th, you might not want to submit it. Whereas if you're above that, it should help your application, help your odds. And then that being said, so like, again, back to Cornell, he mentions how test scores aren't as important for fine arts and music majors. So like, both, you shouldn't maybe submit them, but a lower score won't matter that much. But then basically what he's saying is there are certain scores that you should never submit. 650 on verbal, which would be like a 1300 or so composite. It's just most students who get into Cornell have higher scores than that. So you may not want to submit that test score because it wouldn't help your application unless you have a 1400 or above. And I think always go with your strengths. So that's true for ACT versus SAT, picking one, right? And then if you are in the 50th percentile or above of students who've gotten in recently, yeah, send it. Shouldn't hurt. In the lower 50%, then think about it a bit more. And again, it's just, do you want the admissions office to see it? Is the simple question to ask yourself. And then finally, GPA is something to consider. If your academic credentials are wonderful and you've got extracurriculars and you really have a glowing application, you're really pleased with it, essays and recommendations, they're all awesome. Don't submit average scores because it'll kind of stand out as, that's not that impressive. Most of my students do have scores that align with their grades and vice versa. A nice test score above your grades can certainly provide a boost. For me, my grades were fine. My test scores were great. That helped me. But if my grades were great, my test scores were lower, then the opposite would be true. So you can use common sense for these. I think last or second to last myth or fact. Myth or fact. The composite SAT, ACT score matters, but so do the individual section scores. That's a fact. We talked about STEM. Maybe you got a 1400, but you got an 800 on math. Submit that score, right? If you're a STEM major. If you got a 600 on math, 800 verbal, maybe don't, right? So not all 1400s are created equal. Yeah, that could be a dilemma. It doesn't come up that often. It also is a good reason to take a test a second time to try to super score it. So yeah, it's going to be just a very context and I think setting-based decision. But this would be my, I think, on the negative side, the takeaway. There is very little downside to taking SAT or ACT scores. Yes, if they're lower than we want, it could, I guess, deal a blow to confidence, which is definitely a thing that we work with a lot. It's just trying to help motivation and self-confidence. But if you have scores that you think will weaken your application, I mean, point blank, just don't send them. And we talked about every school is different. Be strategic. If it's a highly competitive reach school and your scores don't help, don't send them, versus do send them to your safety schools. If you're applying on the Common App, then don't list scores unless you want them to be sent to every school you're applying to on the Common App. And then I think, I mean, these examples would be just pretty easily Googleable. What I would do is I'd Google Swarthmore percentile SAT. And what you see is these middle ranges, which equates to 1380 to 1540, which means 75% of people who got into Swarthmore in this year were above a 1380. 25% of the admitted students were below a 1380, but probably a lot of them were, who knows, athletes or just, it's hard to say. But if you have below 1380, it's not a great score to send to Swarthmore. We talk about quartiles. So if you're in that second or top quartile, you'd submit, right? So 1470 is right in that middle and above. I'm submitting that for sure. Third quartile would be a really tough decision for this school. And then you'll just be going through that for each college, right? So like the one thing to keep in mind there is if there's a score that was good enough to get into a school 2015, 2019, where a lot of the data we have right now, that's where that's from. Just because that score was good enough then, is it good enough to get into that school in 2023? The answer is maybe not. I just want to show you how score ranges have skewed, and we'll wrap up today. So UGA, which just every year gets harder to get into, wonderful, wonderful school. But I mean, look at that, just from 2020 to 2021, the average SAT went up 100 some points and ACT went up like 2 to 4 points. Man, that's nuts. Same with Boston University. Just because they went test optional and they got more applicants, the students who did get in submitting tests really had to have great test scores. So in a lot of ways, it's made it more competitive for those selective schools. Penn, I mean, absurd. You basically have to be perfect on ACT to want to submit that ACT score. It was already like that, but now even more so. And then last slide is our middle ranges pre and post pandemic. So you can just see a few others: Emory, Yale in here, Tulane, Michigan, just all these 25th percentiles that went up by like 20 to 60 points. And then the higher end of it too also went up. So that means that like the average score to get into Emory used to be like a 1450 and now it's like a 1510, right? That went up by 60 points in a year. All that being said, this is a straight up fact, not a myth. The SAT and ACT are not for everyone. I say this as someone who's done this for years and years and worked as a tutor, and everyone can improve. These are tests of effort. But straight up at this point, they're not for everyone. And if you can go test optional, you should do it with joy in your heart and feel fine about that. And test scores in general don't define us. So as you embark on this journey and prepare and take practice tests and real tests, I just hope for parents and guardians and students all to keep this in perspective, that like this can get really competitive and pressure filled. But test optional in the grand scheme of things is a way to apply to colleges without SAT, ACT scores. So you don't have to submit them. And it's one of those things that because it's a test of effort, we can improve. So I would just say go in with an open mind and try them out. And if you think that's something that will help your application, then that's something to pursue. On our end, and we're going to launch just a quick poll for those of you just to enter in kind of, if you're a parent or student or educator. I'm also going to put a link in the chat if you'd like to reach out to someone at Alparuth. So what I do is test prep. That's the middle bar here. But we also do academic tutoring, tons of great tutors online and in person. So that's for support in school. Test prep would be ACT, SAT, PSAT, and then executive function coaching, which is a very cool newish thing that we're doing. And if you're interested in that, this is the link that you're going to see in the chat. The coolest thing about this, I think, so you can just schedule a time to chat about it, no commitment. But if you do a diagnostic, that mind print is like a mock exam for the mind. Executive functioning is stuff like organization and planning and things that a lot of my students really struggle with. But it's things that are coachable, right, and can really be developed. So it's often like 30-minute sessions a couple of times a week, and then you eventually go to once a week and then once a month until they've kind of really taken ownership. So just a great new thing we're doing. And then this is the good time to buy because we've got our holiday promotion running through end of December. We've got a few questions in here, so I'd like to definitely answer those. Please feel free if you feel like you've gotten all you need to head out, and thank you for joining. But yeah, we've got a few minutes, so let's answer some questions. All right, the first question is a great one, which is, are colleges made aware if a child has extra time as an accommodation? If so, does that work against them? The answer is no. That's against the ADA. No colleges will know if your student has extra time. No, no, no. And then the ACT, how should we decide if we take the essay? Honestly, the ACT essay is optional, and I think there's like 7 or 8 schools that require it. And frankly, I've barely heard of them. I feel comfortable now saying don't take the ACT essay and it won't harm you. So I wouldn't worry about the ACT writing portion. A few more. Do you suggest studying for one section at a time for each test? Not really. I think that at a certain point of prep that could be doable, but I like to introduce the basics and the test as a whole, and then you can kind of break it up so you're not doing just reading, just writing, just math, especially in a tutoring session that gets pretty mundane. So try to break it up into chunks. And yes, it's good to focus on like one at a time in the short term, but you don't want to be doing like 1 month reading, 1 month writing, 1 month math. I would sprinkle them all in. Let's see. Do I know when the digital SAT will be in effect? They say domestically 2024. So they say domestically the year of 2024, which would be like March of 2024. I buy that. I think we'll see if it rolls out internationally as planned this year and works out, but that's what I would expect it. And I do think we do other presentations about that, but that does bring in some questions too. Just about should I take the paper test or wait for digital? That's a hard one. To elaborate on what I meant by 600 and 800 versus math or English, what I meant was if you had a 1400 score of an SAT and you had a perfect 800 on the math section and a 600 on verbal. If you're a STEM person, maybe you submit that score because the 800 in math looks really good. That's a perfect score. But then if that was flipped and you had a 600 math, 800 on verbal, but you're a STEM person, that 1400, even though it's the same overall score, is not as impressive to a STEM school because your math score is kind of below the average. They don't care about the verbal so much. All right, just got time for a couple more. You shouldn't add your scores to the Common App, even though the schools themselves will ask you if you want your scores considered or not. So that's a good question. If all of the colleges you're applying to on the Common App, you're comfortable sending your scores, then yes. But you may have to be strategic about it and say, well, I'm not going to put my scores on the Common App because I don't want them to go to all of them. And so that means for those schools, you'll answer, no, I don't want my scores considered because you're not even going to send them. And then separately, you would send the scores to those other colleges that you do want. So that's a tough thing. Yeah, that's just, there's a lot of nuance to this. Last question I have time for, and please do feel free to email info@Appleruth or just even call. Our program advisors are really great. They're not going to try to do a hard sell. They're just, it's a good company to work for. So feel free to call or email. They'll answer your questions. My last one for today, before I let you guys go, is if a student's PSAT score is low, should they still try taking a regular SAT? I would say try taking a practice ACT to see how they liked it. Compare both scores, look at some college ranges, and then decide, right? So make it a little bit more of like PSAT versus ACT is one of those worth pursuing. And I think that any decision there is really okay. There's not a right or wrong. All right, I'm sorry I didn't get to quite every question, but I really appreciate y'all joining. Hope it was helpful. Happy holidays, happy new year, and enjoy the rest of your evening.